My name is Bruno Waterfield. I'm the Brussels correspondent of The Times. I'm going to be chairing this discussion. It really is quite striking today how Russia is seen as a threat. It's seen almost as an all-pervasive. It's everywhere. Its tentacles are everywhere. Donald Trump is in the White House, perhaps. Some conspiracy theorists would argue because of Russia. Some people even sort of wouldn't mind if the CIA got rid of him like America used to do in Chile and places like that. Any election that produces a result that upsets the political classes, there will be dark murmurings of Russian influence. Russia seems to be all-pervasive, all-powerful. It seems to be absolutely everywhere. And what we're going to try and do with this discussion is perhaps to pull back some of these more sort of lurid Manchurian candidate-esque kind of conspiracy theories and try and examine what's really going on. Is it a new Cold War? Is Russia really everywhere? Are its tentacles of power and influence and disruption behind all these political developments? Or is Russia perhaps much weaker than the conspiracy theories would suggest? Does Russia loom large, not because Putin is a strong leader, but because Western governments lack direction? Now, we've got a really good panel. First of all, we have Lukasz Pawlowski, who's the managing editor and columnist at Kultura Liberalna magazine, which is a liberal magazine. He's an award-winning journalist. We had a good discussion, we had a healthy discussion last night, so I'm convinced he'll be a brilliant speaker. And then second, also on my right, we have Mary Dejevsky, who writes for The Guardian, The Independent, speaking as another journalist, has an amazing track record, has been in the right place at the right time at some very big moments in history, and she really, again, knows what she's talking about. Third, on my nearer left, Adam Thomson, who's the director of the European Leadership Network, a think tank. He was a diplomat for 38 years in the front line, Moscow, Washington, New Delhi. I knew him in Brussels when he was the British ambassador to NATO, and in Brussels we get a lot of briefings from diplomats and a lot of briefings from officials, and quite often your ears just close, the pen stops writing, and you have to sort of prop your eyelids open. Adam's briefings were absolutely brilliant, and journalists would push each other out of the way to get to those briefings. Our last speaker will be Tara McCormack, who's a lecturer in international politics at the University of Leicester, and very much a public intellectual in the sphere of international relations, and she does a lot of debate. She speaks on the radio and other media a lot, and really is good at making the whole area of international relations really come alive, in my experience. Lukasz.
Right. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me and presenting me in this manner. I was asked to provide you with some Eastern European, or specifically Polish perspective on the relations with Russia, so I'll go with that mainly. So in the latest edition of the Global Attitude Survey that was conducted by the Pew Research Center and published in August 2017, people of 38 countries were asked about 8 major threats that they see in the contemporary world. Globally, it was ISIS, climate change, and cyber attacks, and the state of global economy that came at first 3-4 places. But in Poland, however, fear of ISIS was closely followed by the fear of growing Russian influence. That was the 68% of the people named growing Russian influence as the major threat, one of the major threats facing the country. That was the largest percentage in all of the countries that were included in this panel. Well, coming from a country that has been under some form of Russian domination for the most part of the last 250 years of its history, this might be hardly surprising. But there are also many other reasons why I believe there is a lot to be worried about, and why even some Western countries might be wise to actually follow to follow Polish example on this one. First of all, in one of the articles that you were suggested to read before this panel, it was on the website, Maria Lipman says that in January 2015, negative perceptions of the West in Russia rose to the highest level ever recorded in the history of Russian public opinion polling. 81% of the people surveyed had a negative perception of the United States, and 71% of the European Union. And only a couple of years before, those numbers were significantly lower. For example, 1 year earlier, only 44% held a negative view, 44% of Russians held a negative view of the United States. That's one thing. The second thing, which is, I believe, of interest, is that in 2011 and 12, Vladimir Putin's approval ratings dropped significantly, well, for Russian standards, to 60% from 80. There were mass protests in late 2011, which challenged his legitimacy. And then, suddenly, back in 2013-14, the approval ratings are back at the level of 80%. Why is it so? Well, they significantly shifted after the conflict in Ukraine broke out. So that suggests that, you know, this is a good way. The conflict in Ukraine proved to be very profitable in terms of regaining public support for Vladimir Putin. And if it proved profitable once, this strategy might be used again, I believe. But isn't Russia weak? Already Bruno said so. That we know that during the press conference in December 2016, last press conference of that year, Barack Obama emphasized that Russia cannot change significantly or weaken the United States because it is a smaller and weaker country. Obama said that Russian economy doesn't produce anything that anybody wants to buy, except from gas and oil and arms. We can to that we could add that Russian economy is the size of Italian economy, that its population is shrinking, that the life expectancy is way lower than in the most European countries, and that the inequalities between urban areas around Moscow and Petersburg and all the rest of the country are growing. So why should we care? Well, first of all, precisely because when the country is weak, when the political power is weak, it can become more dangerous, because having an enemy is the best way to rally popular support and take the public's attention away from the problems facing the country. Secondly, in the conversation I had with, after the war in Ukraine broke out, I had a conversation with Anne Applebaum, who said, and I asked her this question: why should we care if Russia is that weak? Just wait and wait for it to collapse. She said, there are two advantages Russia has on the global stage. The first lies in the fact that Putin and his people possess political tools we cannot even imagine in the West. It is as if Barack Obama was not only the president of the United States, but also the chairman of Exxon, owner of the New York Times and all the major television networks, as if he ran FBI and CIA, and on top of that, he controlled the Congress. That's the kind of power Putin and his entourage have. They own the country. The second thing they have, and this factor is strangely underrated at the moment, is nuclear arsenal. Applebaum said, Russia may be a sick man, but it's still a sick man with a gun. So the third issue is that some people in the West say Russians' aggressive behavior was caused primarily by Western politics and by the fact that, for example, NATO expanded during the 1990s. That means we interfered with Russian sphere of influence, and that's the reaction we get right now. So, for example, Stephen Wald, the Harvard lecturer and foreign policy columnist, wrote that open-ended NATO expansion has done more to poison relations with Russia than any other single Western policy. His solution, some sort of appeasement. Well, I cannot agree with, I couldn't disagree more. To that I can only reply by quoting from another of the articles that we were supposed to read before the session. And the quote goes, no reset can be successful regardless the personality driving it, because Putin's Russia requires the United States of America as its enemy. I would say it requires the West as its enemy. Also, maybe we will discuss that later, or maybe some other panelists will raise this point. Also, the nature of the conflict has changed. And so I would just drop in the term non-linear war, which I hope we will get back to. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mary.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you to Lukasz as well, because you're now going to hear a very, very different view from me, almost the polar opposite. I'd also just like to say in preface, because I think there's some misunderstanding about this frequently, I am not Russian. I'm British. My name comes from, it's my married name, and my husband is American, second generation of refugee parents from Russia and Ukraine. So I don't have any sort of personal stake in any of this. I've got 5 points that I'd like to make. The first is that the question as it's posed, Putin's Russia, new Cold War, presupposes that if there is such a Cold War, then it's basically all Putin's fault. And I think that even if you do accept that relations at the moment are pretty bad, that Russia and Putin really can't be blamed either exclusively or even take an equal share of the blame. I would say that when Putin came to power first, 2000, 2001, when he returned to power, 2008, and again now, the running in terms of hostility has actually been made by the West. That Putin, at every stage in procedure, has not only been amenable to improving relations, but has tried his best to do that, only to be rebuffed. And I would absolutely agree with the person quoted by Lukasz about the expansion of NATO being the absolute, one of the biggest mistakes made by the West, certainly since the end of the Second World War. I think it's done more to poison East-West relations, more to trap any leader of Russia, not just Putin, in a corner than almost anything that anybody has done. The second point I'd like to make is that one of the arguments often made about Putin's Russia is that basically it's aggressive and expansionist, and that Putin's ambition lies in trying to restore, if not the boundaries of the old Soviet Union, then the boundaries of Imperial Russia. I would say there's nothing further from the truth, that you can see practically everything that Putin has done since he came to power is about trying to settle the post-Soviet borders around Russia, and that any action that is seen on our side as being aggressive, we talk about an invasion of Georgia, we talk about meddling in Syria, we talk about an invasion, annexation in Ukraine. These are all very different, but that if we take Georgia, there was an EU report which found that Russia actually did not initiate that conflict. When we look at Syria, how many years was it? 2 years, 3 years? That the West basically had a complete free rein to do something positive in Syria, and it failed. And it was only after the West failed that Russia intervened. And Russia intervened with a legitimacy, having been invited by the legitimate government of Syria as recognized by the United Nations in a way that the West completely did not. Ukraine, I would say, is much more complicated, but again, you can see Russia's action in Ukraine not as it were, initiated aggressive action, but as a measure of panic and weakness and desperation about the future of Russian security in response to what they saw as Western predations and claims to Ukraine. Third point. There's a whole sort of litany of accusations about Russia's military maneuvers, training exercises, near misses over the Baltic or around the UK, incursions into other people's airspace. First of all, I'd invite you to ask where the information comes from that. It's not because of journalists like me and Bruno going out into the field and looking up and saying, look, there's a Russian plane intruding into someone else's airspace. It is because that information comes from the Western alliance. It comes from military and defence interests on the Western side. And if you look, there are equal and opposite actions by Western NATO forces in exactly the same way. I think about 3-4 years ago, Cameron was asked a direct question after some great publicity for one of these near misses off the British coast. He was asked how many such incidents there'd been. And he said that he'd actually taken the trouble to go to the MOD and ask. And he said that there were no more incidents in that particular year than there had been in previous years. This was not something that was growing, it was a state. Fourth point, relations with the United States. Yes, they look absolutely dreadful, and the hue and cry in Washington creates an appalling atmosphere which makes it impossible for Trump as president to do what he'd hoped to do, which to my mind was one of the more positive things that Trump said he hoped to do, which was to try to improve relations with Russia and with Putin. And basically the combined institutional forces in Washington have prevented him from doing that. But if you look at what's actually happening, I think you can actually say that relations are rather better than they appear on the surface, and that for all the actions that have been taken on either side, the diplomatic expulsions and all those sort of things, that actually they are at a very low level. There's a degree of damage limitation going on there, which leaves relations at the very top level. Putin has hardly said anything negative about the United States. Trump himself, since he came to office, despite all this stuff in Congress, has said almost nothing negative about Russia. And you can say, oh, there you are, proof of collusion. I would say no. It means that both Russia and the United States, at the very top level, are hoping against hope that there will be a possibility for improved relations, and they don't want to do anything to damage that. Fifth point, when I'm going over time, I would say that if you look more parochially, that most of the new Cold War, totally irresponsible Cold War language and accusations has come as much from the UK, maybe more from the UK, as sort of little brother, a follower of the United States. If you look at the rest of Europe, we've seen President Macron playing an absolute diplomatic blinder in relation to practically everybody. Relations between Russia and Germany, Russia and the other countries of what we call old Europe are actually not nearly as bad as they are between the UK and Russia the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. It's a pleasure to be here. I find myself somewhere between Lukasz and Mary, but I'm not going directly to address either of their points unless I have time at the end. I wanted to make three very broad points. The first is that whatever we choose to call it, the present situation between Russia and the West is a Cold War. People don't like that term because they worry that it deepens the sense of division, because they're right that it's not like the 20th century Cold War. It's not Russia trying to create Russia-supporting regimes around the world, or a new Warsaw Pact, or even a simple competing propagandas. But there is a military dynamic of action and reaction that is now underway and is quite hard to stop. And both sides have an escalation doctrine that leads you all the way up to nuclear exchange. It is actually ideological in a sense. It's not a set of formal ideologies, but opposing worldviews, two camps living in their own ideas bubbles, lots of stereotyping, lots of propaganda, very much win-lose mindsets in the West as well as in Moscow. It goes international, it's proxy wars, There's covert competition, damage to each side, subversion, or at least a belief that the other side is doing that to you. And it is now sustained. In NATO, the Crimean annexation and Russia's intervention in eastern Ukraine has influenced the alliance from top to bottom. There is no aspect of NATO business that is not touched by it. Second point is that the situation we now find ourselves in, whatever we want to call it, is at least as dangerous as the 20th century's Cold War. And that's not because Russia is going to invade us or take down our critical national infrastructure with cyber. Russia acts or believes it acts for essentially defensive reasons. And here I'm probably more in Mary's camp, except that the defensive behavior often looks quite aggressive. And the situation is dangerous because it's still very nuclear, as Lukasz has reminded us. There are very high risks of miscalculation. The situation is less familiar to decision makers. They are themselves more autocratic than during the Cold War. We're much less rehearsed for crisis. Russia rewards some of its operatives for risk-taking and is quite opaque. And finally, and quite importantly, there are really high opportunity costs to a renewed Cold War. Fantastically expensive. Defense spending is now rising on both sides. The political bandwidth for all the complex problems that we face in the world is shrinking, and the dynamic affects the future direction of both Russia, not a successful state, and the West. So my third point is a rumination on what to do about this. Very schematically, I think we can think of three options. The so-called Yalta approach. This is the old-fashioned, tried and tested way. It's great powers deciding for smaller powers, spheres of influence. It's what Lukasz referred to, Stephen Walt, partitioning Ukraine, or ideas like that. I don't think that's going to happen because I don't think we have it in ourselves now in the West to allow that kind of thing to happen in Europe, even though we find it much easier to imagine partitioning Syria, for example. So there's a second category, which is what my leadership network tends to work on, which is risk reduction. So trying to reduce the cost of this Cold War, trying to minimize the level of danger that we face, attempting arms control. But this is, to me, still feeling very much like a 20th century effort. How do we, in fact, deal with the pace, the complexity, the novelty of geopolitical change, and can arms control and treaty agreements actually make a difference? And my last, and this is something that I value views on because I have not thought it through deeply, is something like a guarded respect for difference. Respect because, as Tom Friedman reminds us, humiliation is the most underrated factor in foreign affairs, and Russia is deeply humiliated by the 1990s. Guarded because others, including Russia, will take advantage of you if you don't stand up for your own interests and values. And an appreciation for difference because it's getting harder for the West to create its own reality. The Bush administration's conceit and hubris, and our behaviors have unintended consequences. So more diplomacy, more, as the US Declaration of Independence has it, respect for the opinion of mankind, decent respect for the opinion of mankind, and just traveling hopefully. And I will get to Mary and NATO expansion in questions.
Thank you, Adam. Tara.
All right, thank you very much, Bruno. Hard to follow on from three very good points here just made. Okay, but I will try. So, when we say Cold War, what do we mean? Okay, well, within that term, there is some sense that we are in some kind of almost inevitable clash or conflict of interests and wills, politics, ideology. So what is it that the West is up against in this conflict? So there are accusations, as we know, as Bruno said at the start, hacking, interfering in elections, from America to France, Germany, Catalonia, the Brexit vote, putting Trump in the White House. So accusations of a vast deal of political interference. Also, military aggression. Russia, it's argued, has overturned the international rule of law with its annexation of Crimea, an act that's threatening the liberal world order. Russia, in this framing, is the military aggressor here, threatening NATO allies along the border. The Baltic states and Poland, in this kind of understanding, are in peril from invasion and occupation. So certainly, there seems to be no end to the Kremlin's reach. You know, the phrase is Cold War 2.0, but this is the Cold War on steroids, really, if one sort of believes all of it. The problem is, however, that very little of it is true, or very little of it is as it is generally presented. And I do think, this is just an aside, and maybe something people want to come back, we can talk about later. I do think, apart from a few journalists, and Mary being one of them, our mainstream media here and in America has really been criminally negligent, I think, in its duties in the way that this is being presented to us. Now, I have lost count of the number of "here is the smoking gun" headlines for proof of all of Russia's nefarious activities, but I said very little of it turns out to be true. Russia didn't put Donald Trump in the White House. Trump won because of a whole series of well-understood social trends, combined with the fact that Hillary Clinton was very unpopular, and the Democrats knew this. The shattered sort of memoirs, as they're called, or the discussion of the campaign called Shattered by two very friendly journalists is very good. So this, and also we have had some dodgy gerrymandering and sort of voter registration things that went on in America. So Trump won because of a whole set of very well understood things. It wasn't Russia that did it. We constantly have big stories that appear. For example, most recently, Russia actually interfered with state voting systems. That was the big headline about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And then, of course, a couple of weeks later, there are smaller headlines saying, oh no, Wisconsin says no, actually there was no intervention. We know now, it's just come out last week, the infamous Steele dossier, the tales of Trump and prostitutes in Moscow, was essentially commissioned by a company paid that the Democrats had paid to write this report. So, American intervention, Russian interference in American politics, I would say, it's just not true. Very little of it is true. Now, as for Brexit or the Catalan referendum being a Kremlin op, I don't really even know what to say. I think it's harder in Britain and in other European states to really kind of promote that line. Politics are smaller here in Britain. We're much closer to it. I mean, if you seriously believe that 75% of voters in Boston, Lincolnshire, voted Leave because of Kremlin-sponsored Facebook ads, or Russia Today, I don't really know what to say about that. Again, the Brexit referendum, it's a result of a whole set of social trends we know about. Equally, the Catalonian crisis. The head of the French cybersecurity agency, Guillaume Popard, excuse my accent, says that the hacking that occurred just before the French election was nothing to do with Russia. There's an Associated Press interview in which he says that the election hacking was so generic that it literally could have been anyone. We've had crazy, laughable headlines recently. The German elections actually saying, "Where are the Russians?" So So I think that most of the discussion about Russian political interference is simply not true. Now, the idea, moving on to the military issues, which are real, but I would say the idea that the Russian annexation of Crimea was a sort of appetizer for the main course of invasion of the Baltics and Poland, you know, the idea that Russia will invade NATO countries and embark on an occupation and war that would make Iraq look like a success and bring about Russia's own destruction is, you know, frankly nonsense. Now, we can agree or disagree with Russian policy in Ukraine, and I am what the French calls a sovereigntist. I support sovereignty. I do not support the annexation of bits of other countries. However, I do understand it. It is a largely defensive action. But the main point here is that the idea it's a sort of precursor to a kind of rampage across Europe is, frankly, very problematic. Now, I think we're reaching a point of absurdity in the kind of so-called Russiagate. You know, Russia used Pokemon Go. For those of us with small children, we know much about Pokemon. It used Facebook puppy ads. It spent, you know, $100,000 worth of Facebook ads in America. I mean, you know, I think I can't remember how many billions were spent on the American elections. You know, I think if we're threatened by $100,000 worth of Facebook ads, 50% of which were shown after the election, we really are in trouble. So, to me, I think it's a kind of last days of Rome madness when one reads all this. So what is going on? All right, I'm wrapping it. This is my last point. I think that, to go back to Lukasz's point, it is us who need the enemy, the political enemy. I think we have such a profound political crisis in America, a profound political crisis, less so in Europe, but we have such a profound political crisis that the American political class would rather burn down their own house, right, than understand their own society and engage with their own political problems. And I think that to me really is terrifying, that we have a political class that would rather destroy themselves and their own country. So that would be my final.
Thank you. I just want to get some to and fro on the panel just to explore, see where we are, and then out to the audience. Lukasz, who needs the enemy? Why is it? You said yourself and explained very eloquently how weak Russia is, but you started to say that Russia is also different in terms of the political tools that Putin has. So is this an enemy that the West needs to find, perhaps a West that has some direction, or is it a real enemy? And are there the different? I'd still quite like to get a bit more of a flavour that you bring to this as being Polish, because Poland is different from Britain in terms of its proximity and history with Russia.
Well, I could say maybe it's not an enemy, but it's definitely an adversary. That's one point. The second thing is, like, we were told that Putin's actions were defensive actions. Well, it depends how do you define a defensive actions. If you just punch somebody in the face before they can do anything, you can say you did it in your own defense because you felt threatened, and that's a defensive action. But I would, to be very concrete, back in 2005, Vladimir Putin famously described collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. That's how many? 12 years ago. Munich Conference, 2007. And here's a quote from Putin. The United States has overstepped its borders in all spheres, economic, political, and humanitarian, and has imposed itself on other states. The US have created a unipolar world. No matter how we beautify this term, it means one single center of power, one single center of force, one single master. Zapad 2009, these are military exercise conducted regularly by the Russians. Do you know what did they exercise? That was a nuclear attack on Warsaw. That was the story that in this exercises. 2014 Valdai Club speech by Putin. We are sliding into the times when instead of the balance of interest and mutual guarantees, it is fear and the balance of mutual destruction that prevent nations from engaging in direct conflict. This is not a defensive kind of talk. This is an aggressive kind of talk.
Mary, that does sound quite aggressive, doesn't it?
Well, I'd like to start with the absolute basic first principle, which is this quote from Putin about the collapse of the Soviet Union being the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. This has been quoted so often, and it's been mistranslated. Second of all, it's been taken out of context. And third of all, Putin has tried and tried to go back on this, to try and explain what he meant. And nobody has taken a blind bit of notice. To go for the translation element first, what he actually said was that this was one of the greatest. Now, you may say that this is hair-splitting and doesn't mean anything. But it's a different form of the word in Russian, and it puts it in a slightly less of this sort of gigantic single historical thing. What Putin said he was talking about, and when you look at the context where he was speaking, he said that he was talking about it being a catastrophe for Russia and Russians, in the sense that what happened was the whole destruction of the economy, total collapse internally, and lawlessness inside Russia, that he wasn't talking about looking forward to saying that we should resurrect the Soviet borders or the Soviet Union. It wasn't about that. It was about accepting that this is what had happened, but being, if you like, regretting that it had happened in the way that it happened. And I think you can. He's tried to explain this. I mean, I've heard him twice, 3 times, trying to clarify that this wasn't nostalgia for the Soviet Union. It was regret for what had happened, in the way that it happened. And I think that we've allowed, as it were, this misinterpretation to dominate everything we've thought about post-Soviet Russia.
Adam, you said something that was quite, we said a lot that was very interesting, but you said one of the things that the West can't create is its own reality, and if you look at, in terms of strategy, or perhaps the absence of strategy, Syria, Libya, even Iraq, Afghanistan, there seems to be a void there in terms of the West, in terms of its own reality, in terms of any sense of mission, the ability to project power or values, as people call it now. So is it is part of this picture the fact that the West can't make its own reality means it's sort of in that absence, it's using Putin as some kind of crutch or a substitute, an adversary or an enemy or a rival that kind of fills that void, that it's easy to compensate for the fact that you've lost some of that mission and coherence?
I'm not sure it's quite like that. Let me see if I can answer that briefly. The experience of Iraq, I was at the United Nations trying to get that second resolution through in 2003 in the Security Council, or Afghanistan, where I've spent 12 years of my career working on it, or indeed Libya, all show that nation building is far more difficult than the West of the early 2000s ever imagined. It shouldn't be a surprise to us. Changing a country's culture through foreign intervention is a pretty difficult task. And that clearly drove the Obama administration's thinking to a significant degree. The United States, the world's largest economy, its greatest superpower, could no longer afford what it had taken on, let alone new adventures. So the pullout from Iraq and Afghanistan. So militarily, I think we've learnt that the West can't just barge in and set up things in its own likeness. I'm more optimistic about the West's positioning and less despairing than quite a lot of current commentary about the West in general, because I think we create a tremendous amount of the world's reality through our soft power. And although that is now more contested than at any time since the Second World War, it's still dominant. So my answer to where we go is really to take our own values more seriously, to stick up for them more, but in a more sophisticated way that appreciates that other people don't actually share the way we think and the values we hold. As for the way we treat Russia, I think it is a mixture, I'm sorry to say, of the United States especially, but to some extent the United Kingdom and the West more generally requiring an enemy. And some of that has to do with the defense industry interests and the machinery of government. And some of it is about genuinely bad Russian behavior that is really quite alarming.
So, Tara, you painted a picture. I wanted to ask you about, how to proceed, because even with the picture you've painted of the sort of extreme alarmism, the breakdown of political consensus, and some of the democratic traditions and norms in the West are feeding into this. But it does seem that there is considerable scope for miscalculation, because after all we are talking about relations between states and the military aspect as well, and a country that is on the defensive, is weak, and sometimes chaotic even.
Where do we go?
So what's the way forward?
I really don't know. I mean, I have to say that, not just complimenting Adam because he is here, the European Leadership Network, for example, is a really great think tank that produces a lot of very serious, sober reports and discussions on international affairs. So it's quite a sane voice, but these sane voices are few and far between, and I genuinely don't know, because I think the consensus in the media is so strong, and so apart from a few journalists such as Mary. I'll just give you an example. Now, about a month ago or something, it was revealed by Jane's intelligence that Russian defense spending is being cut by 18%. Now, I'm sure, as Adam knows, there are many. This statistic in itself, is subject to debate, and there's obviously always a discussion about, well, what exactly do we mean about defense spending, etc., etc. But now, to me, this is quite a big deal. Okay. Now, if we are saying that Russia is a military aggressor, and I'm very happy to agree that annexing Crimea was bad behaviour. Said my question would be whether is it the first step in terms of occupying Poland, the Baltics? No. But to me, this is quite significant. Okay, Russian defence spending being cut by a pretty significant amount. Now, we saw this did not appear anywhere. And there is a level of complicity at some point that a lot of journalists, I think, said at the start, are being criminally negligent here because they're simply repeating what is essentially government, they are trotting out the government line. So I genuinely do not know where we go, because unless we can actually begin to have a bit more of an open, proper discussion, I don't know how we can do it.
Very quick. 2 sentences.
I think if the US Senate let Trump extend the New START deal, which is the strategic nuclear deal between the United States and Russia, you could begin to create a new dynamic. Nuclear and respect from the United States matter tremendously to Putin, and that would provide some foundations for more constructive behavior on both sides.
Okay, I'm going to come out to the audience.
If you want to say someone as your enemy, you use first name. So it's Putin, not Russia. It was Saddam. It was Assad. So we heard here quite a lot of Putins, not Russia. And if you really want to use name, you better use Dugin. It's a philosopher who actually now is really most influential on President Putin in Russia. Now, what we heard recently in Worldwrite Club, that the focus is on China and Russian relationships with China, and we should look at Start 2, where they have most of the forces in Kamchatka. The relationship with the United States should be looked through the prism of relationship with China. In Europe, it would appear that everything is sideshow apart from Balkans and Turkey. So it would do you just to look at the Balkans and Turkey as a key issues for Russia. For what I read in their speeches and their books, this is what they interest them, not Poland.
I'm always wary of drawing parallels with the past. But if you look at the collapse of the Soviet Union, it was spending too much on defence. It had a very weak economy. You could say that's the situation with Russia at the moment. I mean, the EU can quite easily outspend Russia simply because it's got a larger GDP. If the Russian economy collapses, and if oil prices go down, it might. Is there a danger of Putin doing something reckless to try and improve his popularity? And is there miscalculation has been mentioned? Is there a danger? Something like he might try another invasion. He might, inflict damage on a Western tripwire force, therefore create problems. Is that going to be the danger? Do people see? Well, one, is Russia likely to go the same with the Soviet Union and collapse simply because of its economic problems, and is there a danger of Putin doing something daft, really by miscalculation rather than any other?
Okay.
Excellent presentation. Lukasz, let's turn the Mary and Stephen Walt's argument in reverse, because they would argue that any Russian leader, autocrat or democrat, would play hardball to protect Russia's vital interests in its traditional sphere of influence. How would you respond to the argument if the Russians put missiles in Cuba, expanded a military pact to include Venezuela, helped bring down pro-American governments in Mexico? How would Washington respond to Russia's interference in its sphere of influence?
It seemed to me all of the panel catalogued the failures or the weaknesses of Western institutions and Western media. What they didn't do, though, is examine the situation in Russia. In the West, we have many institutions that already challenge our governments and our institutions, but I see an absence of such in Russia, and I live in fear of meeting young people when they tell me in Russia that they've spent a lot of time hearing the BBC being demonized repeatedly, and the impossibility of standing up to situations in Russia.
I think one of the frustrations of looking at it a little bit parochially, but the Brexit vote was that foreign policy didn't figure at all. So all we talked about was immigration and so on. So there was it was almost as if it was off bounds. You couldn't discuss these things; they were too difficult. But I think if you got into any discussion with somebody, it was implicit in the Brexit vote that it was a challenge, not just about membership of the EU, but also about membership of NATO. That never came out in any of the debates, but it is implicit within it, because the two are totally interlinked. Every country that joins the EU then joins NATO. And I think the way I would see it is that we need to open up, particularly through what's happening with Brexit, open up the discussion more, because Russia, together with China and the rest of the developing world, is looking to break out of the Cold War history. Things, really, it goes back to World War II, and I think, it's the West that is refusing to break out of those that sort of idea. We can't let go of the past, and that's why there is this present conflict with Russia. So I think Brexit, to me, is a good start, and then we can start to look at some new, interesting dynamics.
I'm a former law enforcement intelligence analyst who was responsible for covering the ex-Soviet countries and transnational organised crime. Russian-speaking transnational organised crime is a different thing qualitatively and to a certain extent quantitatively. It is an arm of the state in a very strategic way. Question one for Mary and Tara. Crucial point, when did you accept that the Soviet Union was responsible for the Kachin massacres? And secondly, does the panel have any comments on Russian influence and its nature on academia in the West? I'm particularly referring to the Times and Sunday Times articles a few weeks before Christmas last year about Cambridge and situation there. I was present at one of the meetings of the group involved where I saw very serious and, in my view, totally unfair criticism of the BBC for its allegedly anti-Russian coverage of the conflict in Ukraine. And when I sought to defend the BBC, I was accused by people there, but not by Christopher Andrew and his colleagues, I must stress, of being a Lucasite. Thank you.
One of the things that really strikes me, actually, I grew up in the old Cold War, when it was the Soviet Union, and one of the things that always struck me at the time, and very different from now, is actually people had a lot of sympathy and respect for the Russians in the Soviet Union and the peoples, the subject peoples of the Soviet Union. People had a lot of respect for Russian culture, chess, music, literature. People felt sorry for Russians living under a despotism. And one of the things that's very striking about the current period is how that just doesn't exist. Russia is not treated with any respect at all. People have obliterated Russian literature from our memory, it seems, quite often. Russia is presented as a sort of tabloid basket case, Slavic, barbarian country. It's one of the aspects that I find really, really quite unusual about the current period. Anyway, enough of me, you.
Just to echo that point, there's actually lots of sympathy for Russia in that wonderful children's story, The Railway Children, which is in fact First World War time, isn't it? Yeah, children. My son here is home educated. He called me in to watch a broadcast on BBC TV recently about 4 rifles who are at the moment deployed in Estonia. And there was lots of coverage about the war games that they're doing in the forests to the east of Tallinn, and pretending that Russian soldiers or saboteurs are coming across the border and scampering after them. So I suppose my question is, are we teaching the next generation to be scared of the Russians?
What is the ground level thoughts of Russians about the West? How do they feel about us? Are they afraid of us? And if so, is that because of the media?
Right, the Crimea has been Russian since 1783, and the name Ukraine comes from Polish for border. It's very easy for we islanders to know where our edges are when your feet get wet. I come from defence and I got an interest in Russian with O-levels. But things got quite exciting when I was down a bunker playing war games when Chernobyl goes up. Things started to change a bit after that. Now I'm fighting Brussels, a city of little green vegetables and a rude statue. And if there is no Brexit, I'm thinking of going to Russia, because it's a huge country with 11 time zones. We could set up better trade links. I know, they should have put a younger tail on me when I went to Moscow, but people are always being told, look at all these things that turn up on the internet nowadays. People think it's a surprise. No, it's a big country. I want to trade with them. What's death to man is life to Russia.
You talk about Russia and its increasing influence in the West, but is the change in attitude towards Russia more of a generational thing? So the people that grew up in the West during the Cold War have more of a fear of Russia, but sort of my generation is going maybe the opposite way, that there's less fear of Russia there. And because we didn't grow up in the Cold War and we didn't see the impacts of it had on not just Russia, but other nations. Thank you.
I wanted to ask two questions. The first, building off of Adam's proposal for guarded respect for difference, which I thought was really interesting, and at first thought really spoke to me. And then secondly, I wondered, though, whether a guarded respect for difference would involve sort of unraveling and stepping back on a lot of the commitments that have been made in international law throughout the 20th century, including to human rights. So my question was, what would that look like practically? And second, I would love to unpack a little further what kind of differences we would see in sort of a modern day Cold War, given the fact that America now has much more of a strong man. Are we seeing sort of the rise of strong men in both the West and in Russia, and how might that influence the way that these interactions are going to play out?
Okay, I'm going to bring panel back in.
I would say something about the Brexit point, that most new countries joining the EU also join NATO. I mean, that is true, but it's not true that membership completely overlaps. There are countries that are in one organisation, not in the other. Which predates the main expansion of the EU and NATO.
One commentary, sometimes it's the other way around. First you join NATO, most of the countries first joined NATO, then the European Union, the case for Poland and other Central European countries.
Yeah. And we talk about the West refusing to break out of the past. I mean, I think to an extent that's true, but the generational point, I mean, I'm tempted to agree and have a lot of sympathy with the generational point, that it's something that the sort of Cold War attitude is something residual, and that it could change. And I think that is true also on both sides, because if you think of how many Russians now travel abroad who never travelled abroad in Cold War times, but you can also you can actually argue the other way, where you can say that actually increased familiarity with Western countries and maybe increased familiarity of Westerners with Russia by going there, though less so, actually doesn't necessarily foster or always foster any greater sympathy.
That's it
for now.
There's a
direct question that was asked about Katyn that I'd like to answer.
Well, you did it really quickly.
When did, as it were, you accept that the Soviets were responsible for Katyn? I always accepted the Polish account of what happened at Katyn. And I did so because right through the Cold War period, I was absolutely in the front ranks of Cold Warriors. It's only after the collapse of the Soviet Union that I have become, as it were, you would say that I've gone over to the other side. I wouldn't say that. I would say that I've actually recognized that the Soviet Union collapsed.
Okay. Lukasz?
Well, there was a question asked, isn't it the same as if the Russians intervened in Central America or Southern America? No, it's not, I believe, because, you know, you just look at the history. There were huge popular movements against Soviet domination in the region. And then after the 1989, people democratically spoke for integrating with the West, right? You had numerous elections, you had different governments. The policy in all these Central European countries was still the same. Let's join the NATO, let's join the European Union, this is our insurance policy. And there was an overwhelming consensus of doing so. So it's not like United States intervened in Central Europe to bring those countries into its own sphere of influence. We wanted to join. So when I hear those arguments saying that maybe that was a mistake, I shrivel, because what is the alternative? Let's imagine the alternative history of not actually expanding NATO and European Union. Do you think that your relations with Russia would be better, that they would be satisfied with what they got? No, they would make more or other demands. Why? Because geopolitical interests of Europe on the one side and integrated Europe on one side and Russia on the other side are simply different. Russia wants to deal with separate European countries, as I say, separately, because it gives them a better negotiating position, and we are best served when we act as one. That's my point. Thank you.
It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that Margaret Thatcher famously phoned Gorbachev. The West was not united, actually, on the reunification of Europe. Many people in the West were very alarmed at the changes in borders, the wall falling.
That is true, and that's why I'm so afraid of getting this sentiment back into the Western Europeans' heads.
I think that's actually, I think that's very important. That moment was hugely significant in terms of European politics. People haven't even really digested. Reunification of Germany has not yet been digested at all, either institutionally in the international order, and certainly not politically or geopolitically. It was an amazing moment, and it was in a moment that did horrify the establishments. I mean, Thatcher's response was by no means unique. It was mirrored by Mitterrand as well. And if it hadn't been for the fact of I mean, you know, if Germany, if Kohl had actually gone to the EU and asked for reunification, we'd probably still be talking about it. Tara.
Yeah, so many things to come back on, but just we are slightly mystified by that question about, you know, when will you accept about the USSR's misdeeds? Well, as Mary said, yes, I always have. And actually, yes, the BBC is extremely biased. So I don't have a problem with that. Is there Russian influence in academia? No. I can tell you that as someone who has always been a vocal critic of most Western foreign policy and Western framing of the international sphere, I'm very much, you know, there are a few of us. We are in a minority. So no, there isn't Russian influence in academia. But what I'd really like to actually respond to is that point about Brexit, leaving the EU, and why not NATO. I mean, yes, that would be my position, actually. But whether one agrees with that or not, what I do think Britain has not done, and this is something that I'm actually do look at in my academic work, with the end of the Cold War, Britain had to attempt, but it didn't. We really needed to actually start to think about what are our interests, what are our real national interests here. But we haven't. We've kind of avoided that, I think, since the end of the Cold War. But I think we really do need to rethink our foreign policy, but part of that is linked to having a proper public debate, and that's quite difficult because the media, I think, does not, you know, the media has a very much follows kind of government lines on certain aspects of foreign policy, not all, but certain aspects. So I agree with you, but we really do need that debate. Let's start genuinely talking about it. What are our interests? Why was it in our interests, to support jihadis in Syria? It's not in my interests. I don't think it's in any of our interests. You know, so I would love that debate, you know, that we start talking about this in the UK.
Adam? I'm not going to respond to any single question, but I think touch on Balkans, Turkey, collapse leading to crisis, opening up discussion more, transnational crimes. I just wanted to come back on Lukasz's point about what is defensive. And what's considered legitimately defensive is very differently understood in Moscow, London, and Washington. And that leads to an awful lot of trouble. Russians would say that Crimea, eastern Ukraine, was defensive. Russians would say that the West has intervened far more in other countries' business and has had even less respect for international law than Russia does. Russians would say that, yeah, okay, so they meddle in the Balkans trying to stop Montenegro joining NATO, but that's nothing different from what the West does in a whole series of countries. Or they would say that cyber attack on the Democratic National Committee is no different from what they think they're suffering from the United States' cyber capabilities. My point is that we see these things really differently. We get terribly bothered by Russia's lack of respect for truth. We get deeply upset by Russian manipulation, which we don't think we engage in. I don't know, buying political party influence in France or whatever. Even though we may, to Russians, appear to be manipulating in a different way. We think we behave differently on cyber attack, for example, where there's no doubt at all that Russia is responsible for a certain amount of quite aggressive cyber behavior. The TV5 attack in France is often cited. So I think we need, this goes back to guarded respect for difference, if you like, to be a little less on our moral high horse about Russia, but no less determined to defend our interpretation of truth and acceptable international behavior.
In the present day, still in Russia, there is shown to be support by multiple polls conducted by both Russian and foreign news agencies, support for the policies and the premiership of Joseph Stalin when he was still in power. This support is most prevalent actually amongst young people in Russia who seem to kind of miss the days of a strong Russian international presence. Given this strong support, do you think there is any way that Vladimir Putin can afford not to act as a kind of a new man of steel? And if he tries to reconcile with the West, is that just going to be too weak for the people that he is ruling?
So in terms of improving relations with Russia, do you think that one of the conditions should be basically for Russia to end its support, well, not just support, but really engineering of the ongoing sort of guerrilla warfare in eastern Ukraine?
Having also been somebody who came out of the old Cold War, which was actually a lot simpler in terms of the fact it was a bipolar world, I just wondered about Adam's thought of risk reduction, how that can possibly be achieved with what is happening in the rest of the world, with China, North Korea, and so on, which brings us back into how do we manage all these very complex relationships when everybody is getting their own nuclear weapons. And just to pick up on the point, well, we should get out of NATO. If we did, we would certainly need our own independent nuclear deterrent, and I'm not sure that that would be pleasing for everybody on the table there. Thank you.
Following on from that question, last question really, and we've spoken a lot about NATO, I'd like to ask the panel what is, stroke should, the future of NATO be and other transnational alliances?
We have discussed the efficacy of cyber warfare and attacks, but is it not really the principle of the attacks that we should be focusing on as opposed to the efficacy?
I'm going to bring the panel back in to conclude. One of the things that just has come up a number of times now is this idea of guarded respect, and Adam, I think you quoted the Declaration of Independence. That seems to be a sentiment and a sort of humanist spirit in a way that seems rather alien to the discussion at the moment. So I'm interested in that, if anyone wants to reflect on that a little bit, or whether Russia is somehow irredeemable. So it is an enemy, and the only way to deal with an enemy, as Carl Schmitt would have said, is war. On that note, Tara.
Okay, leading on from Carl Schmitt, I think to carry on a bit from Adam's point, now I would argue that I would sort of disagree with Adam. You know, I would argue that all the things that we accuse Russia of, we do it. Now, cyber, which is again something I work on in my academic life. Now, all states. Now, I'm perfectly prepared to accept that there may have been some Russian attempts, or that Russia was behind the phishing exercise, John Podesta's emails, but we don't know that. But, you know, yeah, absolutely. Now, we are all doing it, okay? I think that is the fundamental point. People may or may not have heard of Stuxnet, which is the American-Israeli worm that attacked Iranian nuclear facilities. Now, we are all doing it. It is true, have overturned international law in the West. Russia cited the responsibility to protect when it annexed Crimea. Now, this is a specific doctrine of humanitarian intervention that explicitly says sovereignty must not be a barrier anymore. So the world is actually more complicated, and we as a possibly declining power in the world, and America and other states also intervene and overturn, kind of intervene in states, both physically. We also do that digitally via cyber. Now, one of the things that's often said to me is, oh, great whataboutery, which is basically a way of kind of shutting down debate. But it's not, to me, it's not whataboutery to point out, hey, we do these things too. It's simply, it's political reality, and we need to know about that in order to judge our own actions and other actions. We know, I was just rereading an article recently, the CIA is very active, always has been, as we know. Suddenly, we on the left think the CIA is our friend. The CIA, for example, was training KLA soldiers in Kosovo. This was an article actually in the Sunday Times. So our secret services, American secret services, we too intervene and destabilize states, both overtly and covertly. Now, what would I like? I'd like us to stop. I'd like Russia to stop. I'm not trying to say, oh, so it's okay. No, none of it is okay. But the point is, this is political reality. And there's a real refusal, often, certainly when one reads the media, to even discuss kind of our own actions and policies. And I think that's a profound policy problem. So to go back to this idea of, I think we really do need to begin to rethink our foreign policy, think about our interests and so on. But the first step towards that is also having a genuine kind of public debate about what we do. What should we do? What role should we play in the world? And I guarantee, sorry, Bruno, I guarantee that most people, there's not really a public appetite for intervention, for example. Polls show that, but yet our political elites like it. So, we really do need an open debate about what our role should be in the world.
Thanks. Adam?
Three disparate points. One, just on cyber. I think it is about principle rather than just efficacy. There is a measure of West-Russia agreement that the laws of war apply to cyber. It's much, much harder to police that. But it's an area where more diplomacy would be worthwhile. Second is NATO, and partly because I promised to come back to Mary on this. I'm just coloured by my appreciation, for what it's worth, of Europe's history. In the 20th century, Europe was the bloodiest continent on the planet. And one of the reasons why we didn't spend the second half of the 20th century killing each other was NATO. I still think that NATO's most important role is not deterring against Russia, but deterring against all of us who are in NATO from doing dreadful things to each other. And for that reason, despite the collateral damage to West-Russia relations, for example, I would want to argue for the continuation of NATO. That makes a point also about the earlier question on generational difference. I think the really profound difference in generations in this country is the fear of war or no fear of war. And I think we need to fear war much more than we do. For the last 25 years, it's been discretionary, and it's been over there. It hasn't been destroying our families and our lives, but it could if we get it wrong with Russia. And the last was just to go to the question on guarded respect, and does that unravel international law? No, I don't think it does, but I do think we need to recognize that international law is very contested. It became acute for us, and certainly for me as a diplomat, over Kosovo. We had an appalling humanitarian situation in the Balkans. We badly wanted to do something about it. We were under pressure from our media so to do, and Russia would not allow a Chapter 7 Security Council resolution. So we walked around that in the 90s, and that was the start of a Russian narrative that the West doesn't respect. That's a fearfully difficult diplomatic problem to resolve. My own organization hosts Russia-West discussions about international law, and the differences of view are very deeply and genuinely held. I don't think we should give up on our point of view. I do think Russia violates worse, but it ain't easy. That's it.
Brilliant, thank you. Mary.
Right, I've got 3 very quick points and one that I'd like to go into a little bit more detail. First, to go back to the NATO question, I mean, my view is that NATO should have been disbanded in response to the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact, and that there should have been a replacement security architecture for Europe. Now, I mean, there are lots of reasons why this didn't happen, including so much else was going on at the time. But I think that we're going to have to revisit that. Second, one of the earlier questions related to Russia and China as the new sort of axis. I'm not at all sure about this. I think that Russia-China relations are much more difficult than it looks from our perspective. And I've just read a very, very interesting article that by a professor in Singapore, the RSIS. And when you look at it from the Eastern perspective rather than the Western perspective, then Russia starts to look much, much more Western with its future in Europe, not with China. Third point, reference was made to the BBC programme Behind the New Front Lines. I felt that was extraordinarily inaccurate, hugely contentious statements made, and some downright false statements made. It followed a programme about a year ago called The War Room, which also, this posited a fictional Russian attack on the Baltic states, and showed people, as it were, game playing that particular scenario. I think both were hugely irresponsible in the way they were done, and they should have been far, far more cautious and accurate. So I think when you're saying, is there a sort of fostering of fear of Russia, at least with those 2 programs, I would say yes. The point that I'd like to go into slightly more detail about is there were several questions that were about Russia's weakness and the, as it were, nostalgia for Stalin as a strong leader, and whether it would be dangerous to Putin to be perceived as a weak leader. I think that it would be dangerous to Putin to be perceived as a weak leader. And I think that to that extent, the relationship with Trump and the sort of hopes that Putin, among others, expressed for better relations, that is what's happening in the US is actually quite dangerous for Putin, because he has a certain investment of political capital in improving those relations. And if things go even more badly wrong than they currently do, then Putin will look weaker than he currently does. Whether a Russian weakness or Putin's weakness exposed by the West would lead to recklessness, I'm not sure about that. I think to talk about Putin specifically, he is, it may not look like this, and I know he's been referred to as a risk taker. I don't think he's a risk taker or adventurous at all. I think he's very, very cautious, and that he's erred very much on that side since he came to office. But I do think that if there was a crisis that made Russia look weaker than it looks today, that Putin's position would be in danger. And just the final point on that, how the West is perceived in Russia. The West is perceived in Russia as hugely strong and technologically and economically vastly richer than Russia. And I remember when I was in Russia about a year ago, there was a lot of talk about, Russian aggression and the threat to the Baltic states or Poland, whatever. And there was a front page in one of the, as it were, establishment Russian papers, which looked exactly the same, a mirror image of the pages that you get in the Western press, which showed a map of Europe with the arrows pointing from Europe rather than from Russia. And the headline was something like the West's push towards Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, A couple of times we heard that is Russia going to invade Central European countries or Baltic countries, and it was said that's ridiculous. I agree. That's probably it's probably not going to happen because Russia cannot afford to. It can afford to invade. It cannot afford to maintain those countries. But it's not the point. Because the nature of the military conflicts has changed, and it's no longer about the battlefield and one army against the other one, as it was maybe during the first Cold War. As somebody said, it was a simpler world with two camps, political camps. Now it is Valery Surkov, one of an advisor to Putin, calls it a non-linear war, of which cyber attacks and disinformation are major tools. To put it simply, it's not unlike the Cold War, that you have Russian political elites trying to convince you, the West, or the rest of the world, that Russian political system is better than the Western one, that communists are better than the capitalists. It's not about that. Now the point is to convince you also that both the Western political system and Russian political system are equally corrupt, right? We are bad, but look at them. So when I hear all those whataboutery that Tara referred to, that's exactly playing into Putin's hands. That's what I believe. That's exactly what they want. And does Russian political elites really believe that, Russia may be bad, but West is equally bad? Well, just follow their money and look where they are sending their kids to school, where are they buying houses, where are they keeping their money. And then you're going to get the answer whether they value their own political system and the West equally. So that's one point. The second point, we were told that Russia, at some point, Russia was humiliated during the 90s, and that's why we get this. That's why we get this kind of policy. Well, who was it humiliated by? Because I would say that mostly by its own incompetent political class. They ran a political system that was ineffective, that was going to get bankrupt for many, many years, and it's no wonder that they lost their geopolitical position in the 90s. It's as simple as that. So it wasn't so much humiliated by the West, it just humiliated itself to a certain degree. And Ukraine, that's the last point I'd like to make. We were told that, annexing Crimea was a bad policy, was a move that we should not support. Well, it's not a bad policy, it's a bloody war. It's a war that you have in eastern Ukraine. So you cannot really refer to it, well, we should condemn it, but let's get over it. It's like, after Brexit, the only comparison that comes to mind to me is like, after Brexit, the United States decided to get a part of Great Britain just to secure its military bases. That's the kind of, and then started a rebellion in Scotland. That's the kind of thing we are dealing here. It's not a bad policy, it's a real war. And I was told here, last sentence, to give you a Polish perspective on the relations with Russia. So I'll finish with that one sentence, that I believe that every meter further away we get in Poland from NATO and the European Union, we get 1 kilometer closer to Moscow, and I would certainly like to avoid that. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you thank the panel, please?